All right. First of all, welcome and back again to this webinar. Let's just do a quick recap of what we've done yesterday by going through the cards. We first checked out JSPlacement to create some height fields, abstract height fields, having some fun with those, and moved on to importing these height fields into Vue and checked out how to modify them and what options we have to work with very high resolution terrains and what helps us to move around in the terrain editor as efficient as possible. Then we did go over to the terrain setup and added some materials and ecosystems for our forests and trees. Then we created a usable camera setup with a solid composition and some good settings. Then we checked out how to export assets from DAZ Studio to Vue and what to keep in mind when adding these assets to a scene, because the materials often come with some very extreme values and make the objects appear not as good as they should be. So we checked that out. And the next step would be to add our hero building into the scene. And that's the one right here in the middle. Now, we have some test renders from yesterday. Again, to recap some of the stuff we did yesterday. I did some high quality renders, at least 2 of them, of the terrains we worked with yesterday. And so we have a better understanding of how this looks in final quality. And doesn't look too bad. That's something we definitely can work with. And then a number of test renders we did yesterday, checking out the quality of the terrain and the height field. Checking out how to apply the ecosystems. And how to move as quickly as possible through the creative process. Adding the building assets for the front, and adding some additional models to fill up some detail, or to add some detail to the front, like this one here. And that's where we are. Now, we had a question a couple of minutes ago regarding terrains and if it's possible to add an additional PNG to an existing terrain, but only to a certain part of said terrain. I just checked it out, and it would unfortunately take a little too long to show this now. The best way to do this would probably be to just create a copy of the terrain you want to modify, and let's just try this with our base terrain. Let's make this invisible. And do a quick render here. That's our standard base terrain. Now, if you want to add a new piece of terrain, height field, probably the easiest way is to copy that terrain and go into the terrain editor, add your new height field, and go over here. now we have all the models visible again. Okay, let's go this way. Go into the Paint tab, and here you can easily delete parts of your scene, of your height field. It may not be as accurate as you might wish, but that's one way to go. The other thing I said was going through masks, but that would involve the function graph, and that would take a little too much time right now. And yeah, that's how I would approach it, at least to a certain degree. If it doesn't require to be super accurate. All right, so much for this. Sure, no problem, Mark. Just wanted to cover your question at least a little bit. Let's make these active again. Now, compared to the scene where we left off yesterday, here I changed a couple of things. I adjusted the position of the front elements a little more, and I added these little people down there. Let's take a look into our working camera and move a little closer. Now, here are our guys, and these again, even though they are very small in the scene, when the audience discovers that there are people standing around, it immediately translates the overall scale of the scene, and they know how to read the image and what size these buildings have and what size the landscape has. And adding an element people can, or the audience can relate to when it comes to scale and sizes, that really helps to read the overall scene. And something like people are perfect for that. Let's go back to the final render cam. I also added some buildings on our base terrain, and for that I created a separate layer or a folder where I put in all these buildings, and these buildings are all on our base terrain, the lower terrain right here. And let's take a quick look at those. So these are on the bottom terrain. Let's do a quick render so we have a understanding of the geography right there. So what I can suggest when doing stuff like this is to always keep in mind to place objects in your scene where you know they will be visible. So it doesn't make sense to place objects randomly in your scene, at least when it comes to a still image. Nothing you animate, because then the camera obviously flies around and the perspective is constantly changing. But when you plan to just render a still image, only place your objects where you know you can see them, they are visible, so that you don't waste any resources, because we all know 3D tools can be very, very hungry when it comes to memory and all this stuff. And so we have a building in front here and one right here, and these are below our tech layer 1 and tech layer 2 terrains, but they are still visible because we have some holes right here in the tech layer terrains, and we have some larger building right here sticking through the tech layer 1 and 2 terrains, so that's visible as well. So so much for the setup and the additions to where we left off yesterday. now let's add this big building in the center of our scene, which is basically our hero object of the scene.
Just to clarify, Karen's wants some clarification on why do you have one terrain higher and floating above the ground level terrain? I think she's kind of imagining that there should just be one level.
That's you mean the tech layer 1 and tech layer 2 terrains, I guess. That's just for fun. Just to have something that looks interesting. And when planning this webinar, I could have gone the usual route by just creating a terrain and adding buildings, forests, and the standard stuff. And I wanted to have something special, something that has a more sci-fi feel, and I think these floating terrains add something to that. And it also, I think, yeah, it just makes the scene overall a little bit more interesting. Okay, adding the hero building, and that's this one again. A asset package by Stonemason, Utopia Cityscape blocks, and here we go. This one will be exported the same way we did yesterday, and again, collect the materials for the object and accept, and boom, it's exported. Now let's import it. And move it into our layer 1 buildings layer. Okay. Again, very small. Now, for this building, I want to check the materials again as well. For that, let's switch back to the work camera. And let's do a quick test. Just to see how the materials look. Now this doesn't look too bad, but we can see that the bump mapping here seems a little too strong. So let's go into the materials for this one. Much like we did yesterday, via edit all materials. So we can adjust the bump depth by just doing this once for all the materials on this object. Okay. Also check the highlights. Yeah, again, very strong. All right, let's do another quick test. And this one looks better. The bump mapping is not as strong. But we have this kind of soft shadow look again. So double click on the object and go into the smooth mesh and change that value from 80 to 30. Another quick look, and the edges of the object should be harder now. And yep, we have a hard edge now, which looks much more like what I want for this building. Let's check this. Here it's very soft, and there are cases where this definitely is useful. But for this scene and for what I had in mind for this image, I definitely wanted to go with the harder edges. Now we have an area where we can place this building. Let me just activate these two layers of the terrain, and let me orientate myself a bit. Okay. Let me just check my notes for a second. We have a specific place for this building, of course, and should be around here somewhere. And yep. Somewhere around here. But to be completely precise, let me just enter my values first for the correct size. And for the correct position. And we need to rotate it.
I've just asked a question to the audience. Sean's mentioned in 3D, if you know the objective is a single shot and have a good idea about desired effect and angle, you can take shortcuts to create the desired image, saving on production time. So I've asked the audience, what tips they think could be useful to, to speed up a quicker result of what you want. Not having to worry about, necessarily all of the detail of an object on all sides. I don't know. I'm trying to think of different things.
When it comes to shortcuts, I'm not very good. I must admit. I have set up one specific shortcut for when I'm in my freelook camera and I need to focus on an object. I click on the object and press F12 to focus on the object, and that was the option frame selected object. And for some reason, in I think 1 or 2 versions ago, they deactivated this for some reason, even though it works in the top, side, and front view, but it doesn't work in the active camera view anymore. At least, yeah, it doesn't really work anymore there. So you can go into the options and the operations and where was it? Here we go. The standard setup is that that frame all selected objects is not linked to a shortcut, so I decided to go for F12. And once that's set up, it starts to work in the active camera view again. So that's something I use, and unfortunately, that's pretty much it. I still use these buttons for moving around with the camera. So yeah, like I said yesterday, there are surely more advanced users than I am. But like I said, I only use the tool as much as I need it for my projects, and so far I was able to move around in view quickly enough to get my stuff done without any stress.
So, yeah, I mean, I suppose you brought up using keyboard shortcuts. I meant using assets in a shortcut way, so but you're demonstrating that already, so for instance using JSPlacement to quickly create some detailed assets and so forth.
Okay.
I've got Brian checking, is this building going to be the main focal point?
This building is the main focal point of the scene.
Yeah.
And the key here when it comes to composition, for example, is not to place it exactly in the middle. And for composition reasons, I also activated the frame guides. Display framing strips, display save frames, etc., display field grid. So I can see how the image is properly split up evenly. So to keep the camera kind of natural and maintain a natural feel to the scene, I didn't place the building exactly in the center of the scene because that would make it a little bit too perfect. And that's something that can be very handy if you want to create scenes with an artificial environment like cities or something. Placing something directly in the middle feels a little too artificial and too staged. And to keep it natural, try to place your stuff a little off of the middle. And rule of thirds, what Paul is saying, also very important. Even though I must say I didn't exactly orientate myself on any composition rules for this image, except the fact that I have a foreground element. Our tower is the main element in the center. And in the background, we have a cityscape. So we have some cool depth going on throughout the scene. And so this is our main building in the scene, and this is the focal point of the scene, and it basically also breaks some lines in the scene, which is also composition-wise something that can be very helpful to make something stand out. And this building definitely breaks the horizon line and the cityscape that is in the background later. And makes the building definitely one of the eye-catching elements in this scene. Now, now we go ahead and create our cityscape in the background, and for that we just create a new object, a plane. And make it larger and move it right there. And drag it into our new layer, and let's call this background city. And let's create another plane, a second one. Rotate this and place it right there. And then let's move these down a bit. Okay. Now we go into the material, and let's just reset the material first. And let's go back in and add a new layer to the material. And name that layer city. And go and add an ecosystem. Now, with the exporting of assets in DAS and importing them into Vue. And if you are a frequent Vue user and that's your main tool, it's definitely not wrong to establish or create a archive with buildings you have previously worked with, buildings you know the textures and materials are set up correctly, maybe even have the correct size and all that. It's not wrong to save these buildings, and that's what I did over the years. Created a neat archive with the buildings I worked with and variations of these buildings. Some of them even modified in other 3D tools where I cut out parts of certain buildings that I liked and wanted to use. And yeah, like these 3 tanks, for example, and yeah, a number of stuff. So for our ecosystem, our city, background city, let's just load a couple of these buildings into this ecosystem. I'm just randomly picking some stuff here. Now we want some variation in the city in the background, so we need a couple of different buildings to create that variation. So let's try it with these. Now the problem here is, again, when it comes to working with working efficiently with memory and stuff, the more objects you load into the ecosystem, the more your memory will be filled up when the render starts, of course. And depending on how much memory you have, well, the more memory, the more freedom, of course. So let's populate this, and okay, now this looks crazy. Too much stuff going on, and we can reduce that. First of all, we want to make the instances more regularly aligned, so it resembles more of a city. Okay, this didn't really work. Let's reduce the overall density and, of course, avoid overlapping instances. And, well, this starts to look a little better. Reduce the scaling a tiny bit. And density a little more. And, well, let's try a render for this. Of course, now all the building data needs to be shuffled into the memory, which again takes a little time when it comes to the preparation of the render process. Now, there's still too much going on with these buildings. We have almost 900 of them. That's a little too much. Let's go down with the density. 500, still a little too much. Okay, let's try these 400. And let's try another test.
Well, whilst you're doing that, Eva's made a remark. I don't know whether you've come across this limit. She says that Vue seems to have a problem with bigger archives. Does anyone know the max size of the Vue archive?
I haven't had any archive that seems to reached that limit, so I cannot really give any advice when it comes to that.
Okay. Mark mentions you can save the population preset also for future use too with the scale and population. I believe I'm correct about this.
You can save the material, of course, that includes the setup ecosystem for that material. And by just clicking there and save this wherever you want to save it. And yeah, definitely that can serve as a preset. So now the density of the city looks quite okay. Now, when let's just take a closer look with our working camera. Now, the reason why I constantly try to do quick test renders is just because you guys have something to see and you understand the progress of what we are doing here. When I would work here alone by myself on this project, I probably wouldn't do so many test renders, but for this for showing the progress of how we go along here, it's definitely useful so you guys know where we are. So the building count looks all right here, and we don't need to go into too deep detail with this stuff. What we can do additionally is to add some additional buildings for the surface, for the ground layer here, because that looks quite empty and would probably be visible in the final render. So let's go in and create a new layer, another ecosystem. Let's call this Greeble, because that's just filler stuff we are going to add here. And for that, we use some flat building objects, nothing tower-like, just something that serves as a filler for the surface right there. All right. Populate that. Do a quick test. Now, for some reason, it removed our towers, and I don't exactly know why. Clear that, and let me populate that again. First our towers, and then our filler objects, and again the towers kind of disappear for some reason. Strange, definitely not as planned, but it works over here. So yeah, that's view sometimes. Let's do a quick test here. Now this works kind of. So for orientation, let's just take a look into the final render, because there I can explain it a little better. So here we have our background cityscape. And the towers here, I probably would have needed more variation. But when I rendered this part the first time, I noticed that on the lower levels of the city, there was some stuff missing and there were quite some holes. And that's why I added this second ecosystem to the material with these lower ground buildings. So to fill up that space. And it immediately started to look better when I moved into the final render. So that's the reasoning behind adding that extra ecosystem layer there. And yeah, for some strange reason, when I added that layer to that material, it removed the towers, even though there seem to be still instances there. Try that again. Seems to be a bug or something. Anyway, I hope you understand what I'm trying to explain here. It worked on this plane. So let's switch back to the main camera. We can try and delete this plane where it didn't work and just create a copy of that other one and move it over here, and that should, at least to a certain degree, solve our problems. Exactly, Brian. That's how we can do that. And yeah, now let's try that just to take a look what it does. And let's clear that. Let's clear that. Let's populate that. Now, the fun thing is, because we created a copy of the other plane, the materials are linked. And when I delete an eco or I clear one ecosystem on one of the objects, it clears the ecosystem on the other object as well. So to avoid that, we would have to go in and change the material name. At least that's how I understand it. I find that a tiny bit distracting and confusing, but I guess that's how Vue works. Let's just try this. And again, these towers disappear. That's very, very strange. Anyway, let's move on. I might have to file a ticket for Ian later. And that's how we bring the buildings and the background buildings via ecosystem in our scene. And are there any additional questions for that?
No real new questions. We did have another question about why not use billboards again. You know, we had that question yesterday. Where,
You can
yeah.
you can of course render out these buildings separately, modify the images in Photoshop and create billboards and plant these billboards there. That surely works as well, especially when it's a cityscape or a forest or whatever that is in the background. That's definitely an option and alternative. And sure, why not? It's definitely an option when you're low on memory. But for our little scene, it's all right to go with straight 3D objects. So let's move on to the atmosphere. That's something we haven't talked about at all, and for that, let me please load a new file. And that's this one. And In this one, I moved on as well and added some additional detail to the scene, optimized some things, and most importantly, the ecosystems for the city in the background works. So we have that part complete. And for the atmosphere, lighting, and depth, we are going to check out the settings for the sun, the position of the sun, and some settings in the atmosphere editor. Most importantly, the atmosphere model we are working with here is standard spectral and not photometric spectral. Now, photometric spectral isn't a bad model for rendering or for handling the atmosphere in view, but I found it a little, how to explain it? I feel more comfortable with the standard spectral model.
We're still loading at the moment, aren't we, Chris?
Hmm?
Are we still loading at the moment?
Yes, it's still loading.
Yeah, yeah, because a couple of people have remarked that we just got a grey screen, but it's
Yeah.
it's still loading.
I wished Ian would add a progress bar or something.
Yeah.
I mean, every tool has a progress bar when loading or saving stuff, but Vue doesn't for some reason.
There we go.
And here we go. Yeah. So, let's go into the atmosphere editor. And like I said, the standard spectral is the atmosphere model I prefer. If you want to go for a more photographic rendering method, then photometric is best. But I found it a little difficult to work with when getting certain aspects right, and I think I understand the standard spectral model a little bit better. Now let's check out the settings of the sun, and for the sun I normally try to go with 100% with the shadow density, because that's how it should work. But to bring out some detail, especially in the more shadowy areas, I tend to move this the slider a little lower, not too much, just a little, and that often helps to bring out some of the detail in the shadow areas. Now let's do a quick render of this scene for something I want to show you regarding light gel. A light gel we want to apply to the sun to suggest a cloudy atmosphere. So to get cloud shadows on your landscape, normally you would add a cloud layer, but depending on what kind of clouds you're using, clouds obviously can take forever to render. And to avoid that, we just can go into the light editor of the sun and add a so-called gel. And let's try this clouded gel. And let's go in and modify the size of this material a bit. Make it a little more prominent and larger. Some variation to it. And let's try and render that. it should make the overall appearance of the overall lighting in your scene should make it look more natural, because most of the time we have clouds in the sky and the sun shines through it, and the clouds obviously create shadows on the landscape. Now let's see if it's visible on this in this test render. Yeah, the one without the gel obviously has a lot of highlights, and it looks evenly distributed and a little too artificial. And when the gel is active, it gives a little more darker feel, but also adds a little bit more realism to the overall appearance of the landscape and the overall lighting of the scene. Now let's change the position of the sun a tiny bit to what we have in the final scene. And let's make a render of that.
I was asking what was the percentages again that you used?
For the sun shadow density, 95%. I wouldn't. I tend to not go lower than, let's say, 85 when it comes to that. Now, the lighting we previously had didn't look too bad at all, but for some reason, when I created this image, I liked this one most because we have this wonderfully highlighted side of this building, and that, of course, is our focus of the scene, and that's where we want our attention. And because of this highlighted side of this building, it breaks some lines here. We have this line in the terrain that it breaks, and we have the horizon line that's broken right here, and that really makes our hero building stand out properly. So that's our lighting setup, and the atmosphere setup. Now the settings I have here are pretty much the settings I did go for in the final version. Let's just try raise the aerial perspective and have a look at what it does here, because we want some good depth in our scene, and the aerial perspective can really do some good stuff, especially if you have a wide open landscape, and this doesn't look too bad at all too. Now, if I would go in and re-render the scene, I definitely would have tried this one here as well. But let's go back to what we had. Now, the quality boost right here is very handy when it comes to eliminating noise in light beams and shadows that are coming off buildings, and the overall lighting of the scene becomes much more smooth when you raise this quality boost a little bit. It usually doesn't eat away too much render time, so you can easily go with a 2 on this, maybe even a 4, but I wouldn't suggest to go any higher because it's simply not needed. For the light setup, it's pretty much straightforward as well. Global radiosity is what I use as a standard. And shadow smoothing is something interesting that can boost or decrease or increase render times. The lower the value here, the accurate shadows that are bouncing off of objects in the scene are, and the higher the value, the more not accurate these calculations are. But for scenes like this one, where we are pretty far away from everything, it's safe to say that a higher value definitely works. When you're working on a close-up scene, it would be better to go with at least 33%, which is the standard value when you create a new atmosphere. And quality boost for a scene like this one, minus 0.4, does a very good job. You generally don't need to go higher than the standard 0 value that's in there with every standard atmosphere. And yeah, that's our atmosphere for the scene. Let's do another quick render. And that should conclude our atmosphere chapter. And I think that doesn't look too bad. The shadows are not too dark, and the highlights are not too bright. So we have a rather natural lighting in this scene. Any more questions because for this chapter?
I don't have any questions at the moment. Brian likes the haze effect. Just as a time check, we're now 50 minutes into the webinar.
Okay. Oh man, time flies. All right. Let's move on to the next one, and that's the train tracks and how to use the Spline tool. Now, in our scene, when I created this scene, when I was at exactly the point we are now, I decided to add some monorail trains that are going through the scene, at least here in the foreground, to add some life to the scene, much like these small people here in the front, on top of the front objects. Stuff like trains, birds, people, of course, can really add some life to an otherwise empty and artificial looking environment. So let's go into a separate scene file that I created for the train tracks. And that should be loaded rather quickly. All right, here we go. Karen raised the flag. I'm sure you guys are handling this.
Just in Karen now. Thanks.
All right. So now what we can do, and that's something I missed to do now. What I did in the actual scene file, I don't want to load it yet again because that would eat away 2 minutes again. What I did was to create a quick preview render of the top view, save that top view in a separate image, and created a plane, added that top view render to that plane as a texture for reference, and adjusted the size of the plane to the 4 main terrains in our scene. So I have a reference to where the train is, where the buildings are, and right here, that bright spot is our hero building, and that's the smaller one on the left there. So that's a great point for some reference to lay out these train tracks. Now, of course, I have some finish right here, but let's deactivate these and let's try and create some new ones. All right. So the spline tool can be quite tricky, and especially because it's generally handled like the vector tool in image editing software like Photoshop. But the anchors that define the curves and everything don't just move on a 2D plane, they move on a 3D plane. So that can be very confusing sometimes. But let's just add some points and see how we can adjust these points to our liking. All right. Now this looks this doesn't look very very straightened out and very untrain track like. So let's enable a geometry effect. Let's keep this at a tube type, and let's have a look into the camera view. Whoops. Okay. All right. Let's just keep it that way and OK this. And now have a look at how to manipulate these handles or anchors to straighten out these lines. Now, when you look into this spline point, the first point generally is the main point of the spline, and the following 2 points are the anchors or handlers that enable us to straighten out the curves. And now the problem I often have here is that in Photoshop you can hold down, I think it's Shift, and it moves in straight lines. And here we have to use these the gizmo tool and adjust all of this pretty much by hand. This can be quite time consuming, of course, but for what we want to do, there's no other way to do it. So we have to painstakingly adjust this by hand. Now, by using the underlying reference texture, we immediately have the exact size, and when we are done with the adjustment of our spline, then we can just copy this and go into our main scene file and paste it there, and it would be exactly where we want it to be, except maybe the height position, but that can be easily adjusted. All right, so that's basically how we created these train tracks. Now, since we are on a time limit here, I don't want to waste too much time here. I think you understand how this stuff works, and depending on how much time you have on your hands, you can, of course, straighten all of this stuff out. And one thing you need to keep in mind is I placed these points directly on my plane object that is the reference of our original terrain in our original scene file. All the points are at the exact same height level, placed directly on that plane. Sometimes, if you don't have an object underneath, it can be that these points are placed at a different height, and that creates another level of chaos because you have to readjust the height, not just the top view, but also via side view the height of these points. So it's quite a tricky thing to work with these splines, but they do serve a job, and depending on what you're trying to do, it's a great feature, definitely. And I've used it a couple of times now, especially for stuff like train tracks and some futuristic monorail kind of stuff. Now let's take a look at creating a train, and for that we are going into kit bash mode again and load up some of the objects that are included in the 200 pieces free asset package that you can download via Gumroad. Let me post this link in the chat again.
Whilst you're doing that, Chris, Dan is asking about the splines, I think. He's asking whether you can group them.
Well,